Welcome back, everyone. So, thinking of what we've been doing in macro, we started with the realization that we want to look at what happens in the whole economy when you look at all markets put together. We did use a little bit of ceteris paribus, but we tried to think of it in aggregate terms, and so we came up with a different understanding of what sets total output level, or GDP, using the income expenditure model. The income expenditure model helped us also then think about, okay, what are the things that can impact the equilibrium level of income and expenditure, or the equilibrium level of the GDP, and explain the business cycle. And that helped us then think about, and what can we do about it? And the first thing we could do was fiscal policy. Then we thought, how about going through monetary policy, because that would work through firm sector and interest rates, and we looked a little bit at that. What we've been missing is price levels. So we're now going to integrate that by going from the income expenditure model, which is doesn't integrate price levels, I just take P as a given, to the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model that integrates that. But before we go there, before we move from the equilibrium income expenditure model, or the Keynesian cross model, to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we have to remember something. You're going to see curves. And you're going to see curves that have the two axes that you've seen. You're going to see something that looks like a price level on on the y-axis. You're going to see something that looks like a quantity on the x-axis. You're going to see a supply curve, a demand curve, and you're going to say, oh, I've seen this. And that's a problem. Because while we use the vocabulary supply and demand, we're just using it as a shorthand for the production side and the purchase side. That's all we're doing. We don't actually mean what we did in micro, where we were talking about a single market. So I'm going to give you an explanation that helps you to understand why this is an issue. Remember the price level? We talked about different ways of measuring prices, and the difference was that the price level was not just the price of a single good, but it was a sort of index where I had taken all goods put together. So a rise in the price level meant that there is a generalized rise in prices, right? So here's the first thing. Go back to micro and remember what we said. Why do I buy more apples when the price of apples goes down? It's because I'm buying less oranges. But that doesn't make sense if everything's prices are rising all at the same time. That explanation doesn't make sense, because in that explanation, apples' price was going down, oranges' prices were remaining the same, and so on. Second, remember, especially when it comes to GDP, it's not only households who are purchasing stuff, it's also firms. So supposing there is a generalized rise in prices, my output prices are going up, but my input price is also going up. And if both output and input prices are going up, there's really no net change in profitability, right? So in real terms, when I'm starting to think about what's happening with supply and demand, I have to think very, very differently about the sources and causes for various varieties of shifts that might take place in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? In fact, I have to think of these curves in very different terms than I do in micro, even though I'm using vocabulary that can sometimes feel kind of confusing. In fact, many economists have suggested maybe we shouldn't actually use those words, supply and demand. It gets very confusing for students. But better or for worse, it's kind of like those flipped axes. This is the words people use now, so that's kind of where we are. So with that in mind, let's now start thinking about what I have in mind when I'm talking about aggregate supply and price levels. When I talk about aggregate supply, I'm really talking more about overall production level response. So what I have on this axis is my real GDP. Right? That's what I've got. And I'm interested in overall production level responses to generalized changes in prices, by which I mean the GDP deflator or CPI or something like that. All right? So the P here is a very different kind of price than price of apples. Over here, it's not Q quantity as in how many apples, it's actually our GDP, overall production. So think of this as overall production responses to overall price levels. And as I said, then what explains why would there be, if there is overall price level change, that's no change in profitability. There's no reason for a firm to say, oh, let me stop producing oranges and start producing apples because apples are more profitable. That makes no sense, right? Everything is becoming profitable at the same time. Or if input prices go up, there's no real reason to think profitability has changed. And the answer is that actually this is where we talk about short run and long run in a slightly different way than we did in micro. But it has similar idea, which is that if you think about overall production responses and not as total supply curves or whatever, you begin to realize something very interesting. Wages are, and this is very often called, sticky. So what happens is something like this. If prices start to rise, usually I hire people and I have wage contracts and I've got agreements about minimum wages, I've got agreements about how much I'll pay them, right? So what happens is that if prices start to rise, wages, which tends to be the single most important cost component, don't tend to keep pace. So it's that wedge between the rate at which your wage goes up and the rate at which prices go up that opens a redistribution where there is increased profitability for the firm. And in the short run, this can generate a reaction. So sticky wages, first and foremost, means that in the short run, the reason this aggregate output response supply curve goes up is that when prices go up, wages lag, which means there is a profitability wedge, and that starts creating a supply response of total output. But wages won't lag forever. If labor shortages start to emerge as production keeps going, we figure wages will start catching up, or at least so we hope. And you start hitting absolute sort of limits just on production capacities. Remember that PPF, the production possibility frontier, that we did all the way back? That told you what is the maximum amount you can produce. And that really is kind of going to set a limit, because unless you have growth, a mechanism by which you have capital infrastructure investment that increases production capacity is going to set a limit to how far you can go, right? So part of what we've got in mind here in terms of output response is we've got a vision of different kind of phases or stages in your cycle of booms and busts, where when output is low, that means lots of people are unemployed, wages are not going to rise as fast. So in periods of recession, when people are unemployed, mild inflation's actually not a bad thing because it creates an automatic profitability edge for the firms. But it's not good if it keeps happening, because over time this means either wages have to catch up. We haven't taken into account, for example, that this way of doing things, of creating your supply response through sticky wages, is a redistribution of income away from firms, away from workers towards profit owners, right? So there might be equity concerns as we go through this phase and so on, unless you have a way for wages to eventually catch up. But without that, assuming it catches up and assuming that as you expand, finally workers start getting employed, wages start going up and so on, wages should catch up, and then you should run out of that, and then you'll see price increases, but you won't see any such output expansion effect. Conversely, while I'm describing the effect of an increase of prices by creating output responses, remember that this is not a supply curve. Remember that this is not made by adding multiple supply curves, because, for example, as the book says, this actually doesn't make sense to think of this as the addition of individual firm supply curves, because, for example, there's monopolists, there's oligopolists. They don't have supply curves. So what we are looking at is aggregate output responses. It's not made up of looking at individual firms and adding it all up and so on. It's not that kind of curve at all. It's about kind of overall output reactions to changes in prices. We haven't had, since the Great Depression, deflation. You think that, oh, inflation is bad, inflation is bad, inflation is bad. Deflation, less prices must be good. In fact, deflation is a terrible thing. Because what that means is you've paid people wages, but the price you're going to get for the goods starts to fall. It's a terrible thing for firms. They actually don't. Yeah, it's really not where you want to be. I mean, if you're in a deflationary cycle, which we haven't been in a long time, because thankfully we have governments that do in most cases practice certain level of counter-cyclical policy to fix things and not let them get that bad. Overall, while we get really tense about inflation, I know y'all have heard about it, there's some real concerns if we ever hit deflationary cycles. Thankfully we haven't. But overall, what you're really seeing is a kind of output response to prices. In the long run, we figure that wages will catch up with prices. So this is a very interesting thing, that in the long run, the argument is, the long run in macro, when we say all markets have worked out, is the idea that wages have caught up. And so you want to think about what the assumptions are about labor markets, which is going to be one of our final units when we come to how this works, because we still have to talk fully about input markets. So here we go. This is the aggregate supply curve. In the long run, we're going to call it vertical. It's set by maximum capacity, and it's point at which the wages have caught up. In the short run, because especially during periods of unemployment, wages don't catch up. There is a redistribution of income away from workers towards corporations, which is what creates the upward supply. So that is aggregate supply. Let's now look at the other side of this market, which is aggregate demand.